I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Lieutenant Colonel Nina D'Amato. With her helmet, flak jacket, and rifle in hand, then Major D'Amato spent 12 months in Afghanistan's violent Helmand province, rebuilding schools and persuading families that it was safe to return. When the Marine reservist and graduate of UC Berkeley arrived for duty, no children were attending school. She worked with the Afghans, allied military nations, and international agencies to repair and construct schools, train teachers, and develop curricula. She's currently pursuing her doctorate at UC Berkeley, is a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, and lives in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming Nina D'Amato, who will introduce tonight's panelists.
This is always a great celebration, and it's always a great crowd, so I'm so glad you came tonight. So we have some fantastic guests here, 2 Marines and a man who loves Marines. First, from upstate New York, I would like to introduce C.J. Chivers. C.J. Chivers works for the New York Times, where he works on the investigations desk and for New York Times Magazine, covering conflict, crime, the arms trade, human rights, and other themes. He is a frequent contributor to numerous publications and author of The Gun, A History of Automatic Arms and Their Influence on Human Security and War. CJ served as a Marine infantry officer in the First Persian Gulf War and found his new career as a journalist in 1994. CJ Chivers. Our second guest, down from Seattle and a native of the Bay Area, is Rajiv Chandrasekaran. Rajiv is the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Starbucks. Prior to joining Starbucks in 2015, Rajiv was a senior correspondent and associate editor at The Washington Post, where he worked for 2 decades. During his newspaper career, he reported from more than 36 countries and was bureau chief in Baghdad, Cairo, and Southeast Asia. In 2014, he and Howard Schultz wrote the best-selling book, For Love of Country, What Our Veterans Can Teach Us About Citizenship, Heroism, and Sacrifice. He is also the author of 2 other best-selling books, Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan, and Imperial Life in the Emerald City, Inside Iraq's Green Zone. Please welcome Rajiv. And finally, our own Mike Cerre from Sausalito, California. Mike is an Emmy Award-winning network correspondent and documentary producer specializing in international journalism across 30 countries through Globe TV. Currently, he is a special correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. As the first embedded reporter to broadcast from inside Iraq the night of the 2003 invasion, his reports and specials were featured on ABC News World Tonight with Peter Jennings, Nightline, Primetime, Good Morning America, and the BBC. Mike is also a Marine officer, having served as a forward observer out of Da Nang Air Base, Vietnam, during the early 1970s. Nice to have you, Mike. So as a Marine, I always used to feel for the journalists because they didn't have weapons. And your weapon was really either your camera or your note-taking pad. So I'm curious, first, how did you find this career? And second, why the war zones?
So I came about it actually by accident. I was leaving the Marine Corps. And one thing the Marine Corps had taught me was that everything is about basics. Master the basics and you'll master your craft. So I wanted to write, and I thought I can probably learn some basics at newspapering. And so I went to a graduate program for newspapering and went out and started to practice being a journalist, not knowing I would stick around. As soon as I got started, I found that actually the writing was only part of it, and that I liked the confrontation daily with a puzzle, trying to figure something out. And then very quickly, I was essentially dragged into war correspondence because of my background. And so when 2001 broke out, I was sort of like packed into a slingshot and fired overseas, where I ended up spending, much of the last 15 years. And I tried to do it. There's a lot of ways to do it, and some are better than others, but there's a lot of really good ways. And one way that I approached it was just trying to understand the experience of combat, both technically and tactically, from the experience of the combatants, by trying to be with combatants and understand them as human beings. And so I spent a lot of time working at the bottom, going out with squads and fire teams and platoons and trying to capture something of these last 15 years that have been so bloody and taxing for the rank and file.
Mike, would you like to?
I would say probably like CJ a little bit, the Marine Corps kind of inspired me to become a journalist. When I came back from Vietnam, I was pretty angry, and I wanted to find out why we didn't know the whole story. And that made me determined to become a journalist to find out more about the story. And being involved in the war against terror, I got involved primarily because I never thought as a Vietnam veteran that we would go back to war under dubious conditions again as long as the Vietnam era generation was alive. In fact, I lost all credibility with my wife and my cameraman's wife when we flew over to Kuwait in January of 2003, and I kept telling everybody, there's no way we're going in. This just is not going to happen. I can't really see us going in, and of course, we did go in. So I think that I really wanted to go and cover those wars because I felt I had to kind of bear witness. Having been in war before, I thought I could add a perspective to it, understanding the military, understanding the Marines in particular. And so that's what I wanted to do, and I ended up doing it. Now, the question you asked about, and the troops always ask me the same question, I'm sure they asked you the same thing. They said, Mike, why aren't you carrying a weapon? And I had to relate to them a story when I went through marksmanship training in the Marine Corps, that the officer in charge told me that I'd have better luck throwing my pistol at the enemy than shooting him. So I said I really didn't need the extra weight because I was not going to be that lethal with it anyhow.
Inspires confidence.
In recent years, there's been so much talk about veteran employment, businesses who should be doing more to hire veterans. And right up there at the top of the list of professions, industries that need to do a better job of hiring veterans, I put the news media right up there. And the reason is the work of the two individuals, one to my left and right. When you read Chris's dispatches in the Times, you see the experience, the perspective, the knowledge of somebody who has once walked in the shoes of the men and women he's writing about. And that's invaluable. And it is unfortunately far too uncommon to find reportage with that degree of nuance, of familiarity, of understanding, and we are all the poorer for not having more of it. And so, having veterans who are serving as journalists is particularly important to our understanding of these conflicts. And I'm the one idiot on the stage who's not a veteran, never had any aspirations to get into war correspondence, stumbled into running our bureau in Cairo, thinking that all the talk in 2002 about invading Iraq was all just sort of bluster. Spent the better part of the 6 months leading up to the invasion in Iraq, living in the Al Rashid Hotel, one of just a handful of foreigners there, but thinking that at the very end this was all going to come to naught. Maybe we'd pelt them with a bunch of tomahawks and that would be it. So sort of like you, and how wrong I was. And I wound up living in Baghdad for 18 more months. But people ask me, why would you do this? And the answer is pretty simple. To have a chance as an American to have a ringside seat to history, regardless of whether you thought the war was a good or bad thing, to be able to see it up close for a civilian, somebody who hadn't gone through boot camp, wasn't carrying a weapon, could enter multiple worlds. I mean, I could embed with troops, I could hang out with Iraqis, I could spend time with State Department officials, sort of move around all those circles. It gave me a fascinating perspective, and it was a unique opportunity that I felt privileged to be able to avail of.
And because of guys like Rajiv and this generation of reporters who did get embedded, who did go out with the troops, there's a much better understanding within the media of how the military works. And I think the the gap that was huge going into that war closed considerably because journalists now had a chance to be up close and personal with the military and have a better understanding of what they were doing, what their job and what their mission was. And I think if anything that came out of the war was, at least initially, there was a better understanding between both sides of that equation, the journalists and the military, and there was more of a mutual respect based on knowledge than there had been in the past.
You have your method and approach. I'm curious, Chris, how did you actually get inspired to push something out?
I'd be working on a lot of different kinds of stories simultaneously, so sometimes you're doing stories that are going to take you a few months while you're writing on a daily basis as well. And I actually liked working in the field. I mean, I hated Marine Corps garrison life. It drove me crazy. I really enjoyed being out and on the ground, and so and wasn't very well suited for garrison life, actually. So living with Marines or soldiers or foreign troops or guerrillas in the field for me has kind of always been second nature. And I enjoy the challenge of carrying all of my own equipment and being prepared. And you know, when the attack to Marja went on, we were carrying a car battery so we could recharge our laptops, you know, throughout the battle, and we'd come to a canal and we'd throw the car battery over the canal and then jump across or wade across ourselves. So when it came time to write, I would just sit down on the ground and write, sometimes under a poncho, sometimes in a stable-like environment, you know, an agricultural building or against a wall, and it never really bothered me for daily coverage. I was probably an oddity in that respect because of my Marine background, but I actually probably am more productive in that field than in that environment than I am in a cubicle where there's a lot of distractions. Combat is, and being in the field is strangely narrows you down to a very limited lifestyle, too limited, you could say, but it gives you not all of the distractions you have in life like here. You know, there is no smartphone. When this first went on, smartphones didn't even exist. But I found working in that environment was not at all hard as long as you could find a little bit of electricity, and if you didn't have electricity, you'd bring your own. Now the longer stories take more time. You know, some of the stories I've worked on have taken 2 years, and in that case you're archiving notes bit by bit and you're filling hard drives with photographs and notes, and eventually you may produce something of much more substance and length. And then that is written almost like a small book, you know, which involves organizing vast amounts of material and then navigating through the editing process to try to preserve it in a shape you like. So there's kind of different extremes.
When I was working on my Afghanistan book, I mean, I had a box full of dusty moleskin notebooks that had been filled from lengthy trips in the field. Learned pretty quickly to write with pencil as opposed to pen, which can bleed with water and whatnot. But you know, there were two types of sort of content that I was generating. One was the more, you know, the quicker turnaround. And with these modern wars, technology was a great friend, but it was a great enemy too, because it meant you were sort of always reachable. And it meant that you might be having to file at various times of day. You might be out on a patrol and the satellite phone would ring. And it's amazing. And how many, you know, what you think are remote corners of Afghanistan, you're up there in a CH-53 or an MV-22, and you actually have a cell signal, and you can be texting. You can be, you know, FaceTiming with your family from Camp Leatherneck, seriously. Fortunately for journalists, some of the rules about cell phones didn't apply as they applied to uniformed Marine forces. But it meant that there was a much quicker turnaround. I always envied the correspondents who were sort of a generation older, who, you know, came of age covering guerrilla wars in Latin America, who could telex their stories in and then sit by the pool and drink beer and be undisturbed by their offices. In my case, you know, they could peck me to death with questions and whatnot and have to revise things for later editions. And of course, with the internet, right, you were filing constantly. But the bigger challenge was with the books, you were having to capture what was going on in a way in your notebooks, in your memory, with pictures that was going to be rich enough that a year later you'd be able to recreate that in a way that had a degree of immediacy. And that's a tough thing to do. And when you're trying to do both, and you're trying to balance feeding the immediate beast and then working to something longer, you feel it's a little schizophrenic at times.
Well, me being a TV guy, our challenges were completely different. Number one, we'd be on the air sometimes 6, 7 times a day, and we had to file instantaneously. Secondly, we had to have satellite dishes to upload our material. And I owe much of our success to a Marine Gunnery Sergeant, Ferguson, who very adeptly got me out of a very political situation with my guys back in New York, because they had loaded me up with 3 footlockers full of desktop editing equipment and satellites dishes that I was supposed to take with me as I was attached to this Marine infantry company. And the gunny very quickly said, "You don't need that desktop editing, Mike, because you're not going to have a desktop." And he took all the equipment, made me leave it behind, which was so fortunate for us. And, you know, it gave us a chance to be reporters instead of technicians. So he said, "You're only going to be able to bring what you can put in your pack and carry." And so that made us decide what was essential and what we could do. We had the satellite dish we put on the back of the pack, and the batteries, and we learned how to rig up the Humvees and the AAVs to charge our batteries while we're on the move, so people weren't crawling over wires and everything else of this. We learned how to have LED lights that we could shoot against a tank that were infrared, so the light wouldn't go on, but we wouldn't be sending a beam down range. So we had to learn those things so we could operate. But Rajiv, you tell the story about always being in contact with your desk, which could be, you know, you never get any sleep, and they're bothering you about everything. Some guy in New York's asking you about, well, you know, they captured somebody over there by the Tigris River. Can you drive over there? You know, we'd say, no, we don't have a vehicle, and that's a mountain, so, you know, we can't. But we had these satellite telephones called Thurayas.
Yep.
And the 3rd day after the invasion, the gunny comes down and he says, "I got to take your Thuraya." And he grabbed the other embedded reporters, and he got a laundry bag, and he grabbed all his Thurayas. And we were all, "Oh my God, and you're taking away our satellite phones. This is terrible." And the rumor was that the French had given the technology for the Thuraya to the Iraqis, and they could use them as honing devices and find out where we were and stuff like this. So we were all very upset that we were losing our Thurayas. By the 2nd day, wow, we don't have to talk to New York. You know, we can report, we can concentrate on the story, and then when we put the satellite dish up, they were going to get what we were reporting, not what they were asking us to do or whatever. And so finally, about 2 weeks in the war, the gunny said, "Do you want your Thuraya back?" We said, "No."
I remember Thanksgiving Day 2003, a bunch of the American print journalists, the Post folks, the New York Times folks, the Wall Street Journal folks, all gathered at the home of the LA Times in Baghdad. And the Thuraya phones, because they're satellite phones, didn't work inside. You had to be outside with sort of line of sight to a satellite. And we all left our phones outside with our bags, and as we were filling our plates with turkey, I remember remarking to a bunch of folks there that, "Oh, this is like the old days," you know, because they had made an announcement they were going to start cell phone service in Baghdad. So, like, last chance, you know, we can be undisturbed, have a nice Thanksgiving meal. And just as we're sitting down, you can hear, you know, off in the distance, one phone chirping, and then another, and then another, and then it becomes everybody's phone outside is chirping, and we can hear it inside, and so people go to pick up their phones. And it's everybody's editor saying that President Bush has landed at Baghdad International Airport. And within about 30 seconds, everybody had jumped in their cars and had peeled out, and the dinner was left uneaten, sadly.
Well, this is interesting. I think what's interesting, too, about this mix is, CJ, you spent a lot of time at the tactical execution level with the troops, walking patrols, and out kind of in the strike forces. And Mike, you were in the initial invasion. And a lot of your work, Rajiv, is sort of at the higher viewpoint level. So I'm curious, what was it from you looking from the bottom up and then sort of from the top downwards? So you want to take that first. That view from the war, from walking the streets with the troops, and what did you see when you looked up, just out of curiosity?
When I had been in the Marine Corps, I didn't have a great affinity for the brass. And so I didn't feel particularly attracted to covering the Big Blue Arrow. And I also thought, you know, like I said earlier, there's a lot of ways to cover a war, and they're all sort of essential. And I think of coverage as sort of more of a mosaic, and that we all cover it our own way, and we put a chip up on the wall. Each story is just a chip. And if you back up and look at the wall with the contributions of the three of us and 300 others of us or so who were there, all the chips may start to cohere into a thoughtful picture of the war. And so I tried to sort of stay in my lane and look at what I was looking at. And I did often feel that the point of view in the rank and file was an antidote to some of the nonsense coming out of Washington and to some of the ambitious ideas that were being pushed out into the field to be performed, which on their face seemed impossible in real time. Which is not to say that the units didn't try them and did not try to do them with a great deal of honesty and effort and blood and sacrifice. But when you were out there repeatedly over the years, I went into Afghanistan first in the fall of 2001 as the Taliban was falling, and I kept going through 2011, and I stopped for Libya and the Arab Spring and started to do Libya and Syria and other places. But I had a 10-year period where I was in there quite a bit, and you would watch one general or colonel or political figure after another come in and say, and here's one very good example, about how they were going to create Afghan national security forces. They had different names over time, and there were different footprints that they were going to occupy, the size of this force. It was given different missions. And it grew to be several 100,000 people, and then almost, 500,000 that they were supposedly going to make. And you would watch this force as it was made in real time repeatedly fail, and fail in the same way, year in and year out. And being out in the field, it was very valuable to see. And it actually, it did two things. It intensified my respect for the troops who were working side by side with these Afghan forces and trying to professionalize them and fight with them and hand a country off to them. And it intensified my probably already organic distrust for the authorities, because I thought that this was not possible. And you could see it failing in real time. And it was actually, for me, it was heartbreaking to see so much incredible effort connected to something that in ambition was really beyond what could be done in the time that was given to do it.
You know, Rajiv and I were talking before about how critical our interpreters were about helping us see things. And spinning off of what you're saying, CJ, we were taken out to see the inauguration of the 1st Battalion of the Iraqi Army that was stood up by the Provisional Authority after the invasion in 2003. And we went and they had this big parade, and my interpreter looked over at me. He said, this is a joke, isn't it? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you have Sunnis and you have Shiites and you have Kurds all together. He said, that doesn't work. And sure enough, if you recall in the news, 2 days after that inaugural parade, they all deserted. But it was so patently obvious to my interpreter, who had no military experience at all, that this was not going to work. And so I think we all saw these grand plans, these grand schemes that were not rooted with any local knowledge at all of what was going on. And that was frustrating, because for all of you who served over there, the dedication, the commitment that everyone demonstrated over there was enormous. And it was sad to see that some of the strategies they were trying to implement never really had a chance.
And my approach was to try to interrogate that sort of from the top down. My approach to covering Afghanistan was to split my time between Washington, D.C. and the field. And I go back and forth, sort of a month on, a month off. And when I was in Afghanistan, I would try to see everybody from the 4-star COM ISAF down to the platoon level and walk foot patrols with platoons and everybody along the way and sort of see where sort of national policy gave to strategy, to tactics on the ground, and where things were breaking down. And then I would accumulate these sort of insights, and my little trick was, as I was boarding the United Airlines flight in Dubai for the 14-hour flight back to Washington Dulles Airport, I would send about a dozen messages back to people who worked in the West Wing of the White House, the State Department, in Langley, the Pentagon, saying, I've just been to X, X, Y, and Z. Fascinating insights. Want to meet for a cup of coffee? By the time I landed at Dulles, 14 hours later, almost all of them had responded and proposed times to meet up that week. And I would share. I would learn about internal policy deliberations and learn about little sort of gossip back and forth in the administration. And then a few weeks later, I would email Petraeus or McChrystal, and I would say, hey, I've had some interesting conversations with people inside the Beltway. And they would immediately say, come and join me for dinner. And that would then lead to a, hey, you should go and see this and get on this aircraft to go there. And I'd do this back and forth. And it was a way to sort of see how the expectations of Washington did not connect with what was going on there, and what was going on down at the field level did not connect with up there. And it just sort of played out in stark relief. And you didn't have anybody else in kind of the U.S. reporting chain delivering this stuff up. And part of what I did was try to pretend to be the interpreter now and again. Once was with a general officer who should go unnamed. The commandant of the Marine Corps was in for a visit. We were out visiting a bunch of forward operating bases, and my beard was shaggier, and here I was, wearing my khaki REI pants, and I had a flak vest, but I didn't have that little press tab on it. And my GO friend was sort of inviting me into the various sort of ops briefings. And halfway through the day, the commandant looks at the general who I was with and said, why'd you keep inviting your Terp into all of these? Well, sir, that's not my Terp. That's Rajiv from the Washington Post. Commandant almost keeled over.
Bad. So this is interesting. So cumulatively, at least on this stage, among you, the journalists, we have about 40 years in this region. So, okay, I'm a Marine, so let me just check that math. Okay, that's about right. So, considering that, you were there several times. You were in North Africa, and the stands. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious. And similar to the veterans in the rooms, you see snapshots of places. So does any snapshot resonate when you go there and you see it and you take it in, you comprehend it, and then you go back in 2 years to that same spot? I'm curious, is there anything that resonates with you in that, any particular place? Iraq, Helmand, North Africa?
On the trend lines, the thing that struck me the more time I spent in the region is how I thought it got more dangerous, not less, the longer we spent there, and much more dangerous. I used to be able to move very freely. I went into Iraq in 2002 up in the north through Iran and came out in 2003 and drove all around Iraq in a taxi, and had done the same in Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002. And not very long after that. Now, I missed, there was a period of time I missed, but I was covering Chechnya and I was living in Russia, so I was about to go back in 2004, and there was a terrible terrorist siege at a school in Russia, and we decided we needed to invest a lot of my energy for a year or two in the Caucasus. So I missed 2004 and 2005, and then started in 2006 going back to these beats when the Russians got ahead of some of their problems in the Caucasus, and had brought a level of security to it that didn't need my full-time attention. And as I started going back, and then in the decades since, I've watched it get more and more dangerous, that I cannot move freely like I used to in most of the places that I used to. And I've watched this proliferation of arms. I mean, it's incredible. The take on Afghanistan as we went in 2001, that this was one of the most armed places on earth. right? There's no real data on where the most armed place on earth is, but Afghanistan would certainly be a top candidate. And the amount of arms that were openly carried in Afghanistan in 2001 is minuscule compared to what's carried today. Similar, what happened in Iraq, and then in Syria, and in Libya. And this isn't a coincidence. I mean, the United States handed out several 100,000 assault rifles, largely to people it barely knew. And they did this while the troops were trying to do a set of very complicated tasks that would be hard even in a secure environment, creating elections, building schools, fostering or even creating public services, building transportation networks in countries that didn't have them, creating a civil service, and a civil service that was conversant in Western practices and languages. I mean, there was a lot of things that you couldn't do if it was peaceful in 10 years. And we were trying to do it while we were handing out hundreds of thousands of assault rifles. And so I've watched it all get more and more dangerous and more menacing. And I watched this happening while the conversation was assuring us it was getting more and more safe. And that's been sort of my takeaway, that we've had something like the opposite effect on the big map that we wanted to have. There are exceptions, and there are places on the map, and we could put a Kurd in this chair, and we could put someone from Najaf in this chair, and they would have a different perspective, because there are people, naturally, when you rearrange a society, there's people who, in the rearrangement, come out in a much better situation than they were before. And so there are people who would argue with me about this, but I think if you back up and look at the big map, from the satellite level view, it's worse than it was, and that's been my takeaway.
Sadly, I think even all of those Iraqi factions would agree with you. But I love this guy. He's the guy who absenced himself from Iraq to go to Chechnya, which might have been the only place on the planet more dangerous than Iraq at the time.
Chechnya got safer, actually. There's probably some lessons we could take from our Russian friends.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think it's surprising that the worse the situation got over there, as CJ said, and it was all obvious to us, we were restricted. We didn't have the access we had to people and getting out in the field as we had before. And so the information wasn't nearly as good as we were getting in the past. And then as the networks started to be challenged financially and whatever, and they're closing bureaus, I don't think ABC's had a bureau in Afghanistan for 6 or 7 years now. So we really depend more on the print guys like CJ and Rajiv, because they have a greater capacity to stay in there.
But even the print world. So think of Baghdad 2003. The newspapers that had a presence in Baghdad, beyond the New York Times and the Washington Post, Boston Globe, the Newark Star-Ledger, Long Island Newsday, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, Dallas Morning News,
USA Today, and the Wires, and any unit that had from the National Guard or the Reserves was likely to have a local reporter around
and
as part of the time.
It's the Times, and the Post has a contract stringer there, and that's about it. Yeah. And the Journal has somebody there.
And the Wires.
The Wires, and that's it. Now, admittedly, we don't have the same number of U.S. forces there, but you were talking about the challenges of bringing all that gear into Iraq in 2003. I remember the Marine air assault into Marja in February 2010. CBS News had sent one of their new video journalists there. It was this smart young woman, but she was the correspondent, the cameraman, the sound man, the film editor, the satellite tech all in one. And she had these two big backpacks. One she strapped on to the front, one she strapped on to the back. And that was all the gear to uplink, plus her clothes, plus some water, plus tourniquet and other stuff. And the CH-53 alights in sort of a muddy field for the LZ, and it's going to mud up to here. And it was just a question of whether she was going to fall forward or fall backwards. And thankfully, as she was pitching forward, a couple of Marines grabbed her in the pitch darkness. But it's asking a lot of people to try to do all that together. But I want to offer a counterpoint to what Chris was saying. I had the unique privilege of visiting a district in Afghanistan, a place called Nawa, a district in Helmand Province, about 6 times over the course of a year and a half. And I first got there 48 hours after Marines arrived there in an initial air assault shortly after the 4th of July in 2009. And it was a village south of Lashkar-Gah, the provincial capital, overrun by the Taliban. There were Talib fighters less than a kilometer away from what was then a British base there. It was taken over by Marines. And I witnessed over time a degree of remarkable stability having been brought to that district. But stability at an enormous cost. Not necessarily in human lives. We did lose some brave Marines there. Thankfully, not that many. But we applied a battalion of U.S. Marines there at an enormous cost to the American taxpayer for a village where there was no running water, where there was no sort of electricity, where people were pretty much living the way they lived in the 14th century. And it was interesting to see what progress we could achieve when we applied a great amount of American resources, not just Marines, but American civilians, contractors, millions of dollars in development assistance. But was always left with the question, is this sustainable? After we leave, then what? And you can send Marines anywhere and good things can flow from it. But do they have the local capacity to take the baton when we hand it off?
Just to that line of thinking, circling back, Mike, when you were with the initial invasion of Iraq and then went back several times, what were the themes that you walked away with?
When we came into Baghdad, this city was very much intact. But within 4 days of our arrival and when the statue went down, all hell broke loose and the looting started and the chaos started. And so the first part of the mission was executed very, very well. They didn't tear up the infrastructure. The country could have functioned, but they missed that occupation side of the equation. And we never recovered from that. And so it's so sad to see all the terrific effort of the invasion be squandered by not having that plan afterwards for bring that country back up. And later on, you would see how the Iraqis would view you. I can remember coming through a tough place, Sadr City, not a very friendly place. But they were all cheering on April 8th, 2003, when we went in there. And then by the time I was back there in December of that same year, they were shooting at us. So it had changed that dramatically. And as you saw the Iraqis lining up, they were sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and they were getting gas before the war at 25 cents a gallon or whatever it was, and now they were waiting in days-long lines for gas, 2 and 3 days. And you would talk to an Iraqi, and he would automatically say, you guys are taking the oil. Because nobody would sacrifice as much as you guys did to come in here to help us out unless you're going to get something for it. And so now this distrust was breeded now.
David Petraeus used to call it the man on the moon phenomenon. The Iraqis would look at us and say, you guys put a man on the moon. Why can't you get my lights working?
Exactly. And all that disappointment then started to set in. And that was the hardest thing for the units that I was dealing with then. Many of them had not been in the invasion. They were now coming over on their first deployment. And no one was throwing roses at them. And they weren't throwing roses back. And you could see then the separation of the mission from the location. And I don't think we ever really recovered from that. And it was so sad because, had they been able to maintain, that country was intact after the invasion. It fell apart after we got in there.
Mm-hmm.
Invasions and revolutions are easy. Governing and leading is hard.
Yeah. But, it's so endemic to the Middle East. Chris, I saw a great thing in the series, the articles that the Times is running, and someone made the comment. They said, well, we invaded Iraq and occupied it, and it turned into a disaster. We invaded Libya and didn't occupy it, and it turned into a disaster. We did not invade Syria, and we didn't occupy it, and it's turned into a disaster. So you kind of wonder, what is the balance act over there? I don't think any of us have the answer. But it's so sad to see the commitment that the military has to make to try to hold their own in strategic situations that really don't make a lot of sense.
So this is a nice segue to a question which I was thinking about, and now that you've walked that ground for so long, where do you see our relationship with that region going?
It's hard to see it going any place good anytime soon. That's the sad, honest truth. We took our eye off the ball in Iraq. You know, we can agree or disagree whether Iraq was a sound war, whether it made sense to go in there or not, but we did go in. We did break it. We had a moral obligation to put it back together. And through a lot of blood and treasure, and involving a lot of Marines out in western Iraq, a lot of soldiers in Baghdad and in the Tikrit area, we did bring violence down. And owing a large part to the Iraqis themselves, who stood up, brave Sunni Arabs, to take their country back. And then we took our eye off the ball. We acquiesced to a second term for Prime Minister Maliki. This whole debate about, the status of forces agreement. We created the conditions that essentially led to the Iraqis saying, we don't want to follow on force. And we enabled an Iraqi leadership to take actions that disenfranchised the Sunni population, that allowed to give rise to ISIS, sadly. We're now in a position where I don't think there's an appetite in our country to go in that part of the world again. I'm not suggesting we should, but it is going to be unstable, and there's going to be a significant human cost for some years to come. It's dreadful to think that the best case scenario here is Assad remains in power and the Alawite-led Syrian central government consolidates control over large parts of the country to act as a counterweight to ISIS. But that's probably the least worst scenario on the table today, even if people in Washington don't want to explicitly admit it. And Libya is another powder keg. But I don't have a good magic bullet answer. But we are a war-weary nation at this point. We like to talk about, our European allies should do more. Well, they don't quite have the resources to do it. Nobody does. And when we get our Persian Gulf allies involved in the mix, they seem to do things in a rather inartful way that has an unintended consequence of emboldening extremists. Our Saudi friends and our Qatari friends don't have a great track record of working with the moderate opposition in Syria.
And they're busy in Yemen.
So, we wind up with Iran emboldened in that region, and a Turkey, a NATO ally, that is in desperate straits, an Egypt that has turned more authoritarian than ever, an Israel that is under siege and is acting in a way that, leave that open for a lot of debate. But you have a region that's inflamed and is probably at a more dangerous point than any time in recent memory.
And my view is even darker. I'm never the optimist on the panel, ever. But there's a lot of things that can be tried from the outside that I think have a very limited effect. and that when you look at the Sunni uprising, which has come to have an ISIS stamp on it, but is much broader than just ISIS, it's a border-straddling phenomena. It runs deep into Syria and runs up close near to Baghdad, and then kind of goes a little bit to Baghdad south and a little bit to its north. And this vast Sunni belt is pitted against two principally Shia forces that are exhausted. And I don't think in my lifetime we're going to see these Shia forces be able to assert themselves up to the borders and be able to tamp down the Sunni uprising, which, again, has the name of ISIS, but it's much more complicated than just ISIS.
But as you say that, Chris, that brings, have never been able to comprehend
The map.
what the map or why this was our fight. We're in Iraq. There was nobody on the airliners that went into the Twin Towers that were from Iraq. There was no indication that there was any Al-Qaeda in Iraq until after we got there. And it seems like every time we intervene in these situations, you're talking about Sunnis, and it's internal. And they're going to have to figure it out somehow, or at least the powers that be in the region who are having all these proxy wars like they are in Syria over the Sunni Shiite issue or the Kurdish issue, whatever. We keep getting drawn into these things, and we're not really having any positive impact at all. I've just come back from the Syrian-Turkish border reporting on Syrian refugees, and you hear the stories of these people, and they, you'll be in a camp or these border towns that are all trying to live, and you won't hear a predominant number saying, well, it was the ISIS who took over my house, or it was the Alawites, or it was Assad's barrel bombs. They're all talking about all the chaos and terror that's been forced upon them and that has ruined their lives. And they just don't understand where all these external players have disrupted their way of life. There were Shia, there were Alawites. They had been there for years in these places. And somehow they were able to work it out. Now there have been some uprising, but by and large they were able to coexist. And by bringing in this external factors and these proxy wars that we've been conducting over there, it just seems to have inflamed it to a point that there's not much else that we can do.
Yeah, I think the only solution is a tribal one.
Is what?
A tribal solution.
Yes.
That it has to come up organically from the Sunnis.
And General Mattis did that. People say, well, we got out of Iraq because the surge worked. I don't really believe the surge worked. I believe that General Mattis and the Marines were able to get the Sunnis to understand, we're not your enemy. It's Al-Qaeda, Iraq is your enemy. We're going to get out of here. But those are the guys who are not going to follow your tribal customs. They're the ones who are going to change your life. They're the enemy. You know where they live. You don't have to play by the same rules we play. We'll keep the gas coming up here so you keep the air conditioning going and keep the cars running. Go handle them.
And the American Special Forces understood that too.
Yeah.
The ones that weren't doing the hard knock all the time. They understood that you need collaboration with the local people to solve this. And if I were, to try to map it and make a list. I used to have a trick I played that the small unit level up to occasionally I would meet with generals and some mid-level and senior State Department officials. I said, I'm going to give you an 8x10 sheet of paper. I'm going to give it to you right now. I'm going to walk out of the room for 15 minutes and come back, and you write down very quickly the things you would do to fix this, right? Like a few basic things that you would do. And the slate is open, whatever you want. You don't have to go with the doctrine of the moment, because we had a lot of doctrines of the moment in Afghanistan and Iraq. And almost invariably, we're getting near 100 people or 100%, people would say, hey, brother, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know what we would do. And one of the reasons they wrote that is it was such a complicated problem socially all around them. And if I were an Arabist or were inclined to become an Arabist, I would spend the rest of my career trying to understand the Sunni population and socially map it and figure out who in the Sunni population, which elements of the Sunni population can run Sunni affairs in a way that, they can have cohabitation with their neighbors. Right now, we're nowhere near that. And we could drive into Raqqa, on next Friday. We could roll right over the border, and the room's full of people who've done it. You could go right in there to a lot of the places you were before. But then what do you do on day 2? What do you do on day 2,000? You guys have been out there at day 2,000. You know what that feels like. It doesn't work. At day 2,000, you need a Sunni solution for the Sunni problem and a Shia solution for the Shia problem. And I don't think we can solve this in the interim with, smart munitions. I don't think it works. I think that's one thing we should have learned in the last 15 years.
And Rajiv, do you think that squares up in Afghanistan too? That problem is solved organically, or is it facilitated by an external power?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Same dynamics there. It's not sectarian, but it is tribal. And ultimately, they will come to a degree of accommodation. And as we continue to pull back, the Afghans who've been relying on us as a crutch will have to triage. And there have been places that we pushed into, and we pushed the Afghans into, that they had no business being in. You can hold the center without holding every square inch of that country. And there are going to be some places that will be written off to the Taliban. There'll be other places that they will have to make a stand around. And the Afghans will be the ones to decide whether they can, what places matter. And whether they can triage it well enough will depend on whether the great experiment survives, and whether they can cut the right deals with various power brokers and chieftains and settle, or at least broker, tribal feuds. But it's all politics. I mean, all this stuff comes down to politics. Our fighting men and women, and quite frankly, the Iraqi and Afghan fighting men have done a pretty good job. Our fighting men and women have done an excellent job, in my humble opinion. But ultimately, the failure here is politics in both countries. And that's the solution.
Yeah, it's not going to be resolved on the battlefield. Afghan's not going to be resolved in going back to Marja or any of those other places. It's going to be resolved in Pakistan. The powers that be have to agree on what the future of that country is going to be.
And let me just bring this back to journalism. Because too often we are focused on the tactical fight. Did we storm into this town well? How did this operation go? Are our troops getting drawn down quickly enough? We miss the big picture. And the big picture in the important stories are not just military stories. They're political, military, cultural, tribal, religious stories. And they involve not just understanding the service members that are deployed there, but understanding the local populations, the local leaders, the influences that lead them to want to fight each other and want to compromise. And that's the tough part. And that's why some of this reporting is so hard. And I think in most cases we get it wrong. It's easy to get sort of seduced by the bright shiny object, or this one moment in time. And what we don't do enough of is putting things in that bigger context, so people back home can understand why this matters and whether this is sustainable, and what the impact is ultimately going to be for the American people back home.
I'd like to ask, what are your influences and what are you reading right now?
I'll just throw one unusual influence out that I thought guided a way of seeing war in many ways the way Rajiv just described, like broader than what you can see right in front of you, or broader than the bright object, which is a lot of what you might want to know about war was written by E.B. Sledge. And if you read E.B. Sledge, you see Marines doing extraordinary things. You see them as human beings. You also see them hooked up to something absolutely horrible and dehumanizing to them and to the people they were fighting. And I mean, it's ultimately a human story. Now, it's set against a bloodier canvas than any of us probably in this room have ever or will ever see. But he was able to capture in one book the small and the large and tie it all together. And although in some ways it's a celebration of who the Marines were on his left and right, at least those who managed to survive, and not many of them did, in another, it's a denunciation of organized violence and its utility to solving your problem. Like when you know, he doesn't spend much time on that, but it's clear he came away a near pacifist. He says he couldn't even kill a rabbit at one point, doesn't he, after the war? That's a hard-won truth. And he also wonders whether the grand battle of Peleliu in Marine Corps lore was even necessary, or it could have been bypassed. He's clearly haunted by that question, while remaining fiercely loyal to the people he was with. And I think that that book probably influences how I see conflict more than, you know, a lot of the more traditional sources. And I picked that up as a second lieutenant, because we were, under the Marine Corps, we were not just encouraged, we were forced to read. And it was valuable, really valuable.
Well, I've been listening to this book on tape about T.E. Lawrence and took a long drive to Idaho this summer. And I was just amazed by the parallels of what he was experiencing then and with the Turks and the British and the duplicity of the foreign governments that were in there that were already divvying up that area while the tribes are fighting and not realizing they're going to be completely taken out of the deal. And I kept thinking of the parallels. That's what's happening there. And of course, he was always frustrated because his command didn't know, his politicians didn't know really what it was like on the ground. And I see some of those same problems. And you know, it was interesting seeing your book. You use that as a quote, from T.E. Lawrence at the beginning there, of, you know, we just haven't learned over the years about how it works over there.
So I've got an unconventional answer. I've stopped reading. Not in time. I've stopped reading nonfiction accounts of both the wars, and I've turned instead to fictional accounts written by veterans. And if anybody in this room has not read Redeployment by Phil Cly, I urge you to go and download that tonight. I think Green on Blue by Elliot Ackerman is a phenomenal book. I think there is a great new wave of literature coming out written by men and women who've served. And that will add to our canon about the modern wars. And I think it will make us much smarter and widen our perspective and nuance about these. And I, for one, think that it's just a great addition to the bookshelves of America.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Please give a round of applause for our guests.
I'm going to give them each a salute to Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans plaque. Again, kind of commemorating this evening, each of their names on there. And for those of you who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are here to commemorate that fight, to remember the sacrifices of our fallen brothers and sisters, and also to gather as veterans to support each other in the years ahead. We also have some Vietnam veterans in the crowd, and I also extend my thanks to them because our Vietnam veterans are the ones that made sure when we came back from Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Iraq and Afghanistan that we got treated in a totally different way than they did. So I want to thank them as well.